All right, we're continuing our study of hermeneutics and how to study the Bible. We're going to talk tonight about how to use translations or the use of translations. Hopefully you're taking some notes along the way that'll be helpful. If a reminder, this material, that is the slides, if you want to have access to that, you can email me, but they're available on our website. Go to Bible class schedule on the opening page and click on that and you'll see the hermeneutics class, and click on that and you'll have a link to the handout. The handout, if you're missing that, you miss a week and you want to catch up with that, it'll be posted there, as well as the PowerPoint slides if you want to see those. All right, we're going to talk about the use of translations. I'll remind you of our Bible study challenge. Hopefully you're keeping up with that and trying to read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. You won't catch it every day, I'm sure, but if you can catch it as often as you can, read through that and that'll be helpful, and we'll talk more about that later. All right, we're ready for lesson number 8, the use of translations. Just to give you a heads up of where we're headed, we're going to talk about words, and then we're going to get into Hebrew and Greek words for 2 lessons, and talk about studying those words and what that means, etc. We've talked several times about keeping 2 levels going. We've primarily stayed at the basic level. A little bit later when we get to the Hebrew words, Greek words, we get into figurative language. We're going to dig down just a little bit deeper. We will just a little bit today, not much, but we're going to talk about some things that you may think goes below the basics. We'll get to that in a moment. This is what I call the basic level. When I'm studying a text, I always start at the basic level, which involves reading the text, rereading the text, and rereading the text, and then taking the context, looking for structure, that is some thought patterns, get me a basic structural outline. But one of the first things I'm going to do, whether I'm studying a single verse or I'm studying the whole chapter, whether I'm preparing for a class or someone has asked me a question about a verse, that I'm going to check translations, particularly on phrases that I don't think are clearly understood, either by me or they will be clearly understood by the student who's going to be listening. And so I'll check translations. That's one of the first basic things I do when I'm looking at a verse. Before I look at some of the other things, for example, before I go to a lexicon and see what the word means, I'm going to probably check translations. That's one of the basic things that I do, and I hope you'll do the same kind of thing. Now, here's our goal in study, and this includes our study tonight. And that is, as I'm studying a text, whether I'm studying a whole chapter or I'm studying a particular verse, the goal is I want to know the passage well enough that I could explain it to others. And before you're quick to say, well, I'm not a teacher, so I don't need that, that's not the point. Whether you're teaching or not, or whether you ever plan to teach, if you know the passage well enough that you could explain it to someone else, then you have a pretty good understanding of the passage. And what I'm suggesting is that comparing translations will help with that. So do I understand this verse? You say, well, I think I know what it means. Okay, can you explain it to me? You say, well, I don't know that I can do that. Well, maybe I need to study a little more so that I'm equipped, so that if someone asks me, did you understand verse 12 in our study tonight, you could explain it to them. That's our goal. And that's what we're seeking to accomplish. 4 things we're going to talk about in the use of translations. All translations are not equal. It'll be the first point we're going to make, and then we'll talk about main text versus comparative text. 2 ways to check translations, and hopefully we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about some examples of how this works and whet your appetite for doing this practice if you're not already doing it. I think some preparatory work before we just jump into checking translations. We need to establish that all translations are not equal. Why would I say that? Okay, well, you're right. Commentaries are that way. But details, how detailed they are in the translation, that we'll word that another way in just a moment. Why would I say that?
Different methods of translation. They can go for a word-for-word thought, or they can go for a paraphrase.
All right. Very good. There are 3 things I want you to see with reference to translations. And this is the Cliff Notes version. This is obviously not a scholarly dissertation here. But just understand about translations. Any kind of translation is available to us. By that I mean anything you want, teaching anything you want, it's available. There's literal and wooden translations. I use the word wooden. You'll find that in textual criticism. What that means is that it's a little more rigid. That's what we mean by wooden. It's not flexible. It's not talking about the binding on the cover. What it's talking about is the translation itself. It's wooden, it's more literal. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the free. The free doesn't have to do with what you paid for it has to do with the style of translation. It's free, it's loose, and even ultimately to a paraphrase. So you're looking at, on a spectrum scale, you have the most literal, then you have some that are a little less literal than that one, and then you have the ultimate paraphrase out there and everything in between. So I'm trying to suggest to you that all translations are not equal. You have one man versus a committee. What would be the danger of one man? I'm not saying it's wrong. There's some good translations that are one man translations, but there's a little bit of a danger.
There's no checks and balances.
No one to check him. Where a committee, you've got a whole group of men, sometimes 40-something men, maybe 100 men, checking each other's translations. And then they insert denominational doctrines. Let me give you a sample of that. The New World Translation that was produced by the Jehovah's Witnesses say that Jesus was a God. John 1 and verse 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. Not God, but a God. They've inserted their denominational concept. The Amplified Version takes Ephesians 5:19 and adds and play. Sing, and they put in brackets and play. They've added that to the text. The New International has a heavy flavor of Calvinism. I was born in sin. That's not what Psalm 51:5 says, but it translates that I was born in sin. That is a mistranslation. That same doctrine comes and bleeds out in Romans 8 with man's sinful nature. And so it's heavily Calvinistic, and more about that translation a little bit later. Here's the second thing I want you to see about translation, the theory of translation. Now, this is what Shannon referred to a moment ago, the view of the translators. Some of them respect verbal inspiration, and they seek to make a more literal translation. That's called formal equivalence. So if you're reading about your translation and say they had held to the formal equivalence, they hold to this concept. There's more emphasis on strict adherence to the original text than readability. You say, I want to be able to read it and understand it. That's great. But what I'm wanting is a text where they translate it. If I have to kind of study to figure out what it says, I want to know exactly what the Lord said. That's formal equivalence. The other extreme takes, or the other side of the spectrum, takes a looser approach in telling us what it means. That's called dynamic equivalence, or functional equivalence, they call that. And that's where the emphasis is on readability more than a strict adherence to the text. Now, I have had connections with bookstores, both in business and in just having friends that own bookstores, and I've spent a lot of time in bookstores operated by brethren, and been there where they were selling Bibles, and I've had to wait on customers for them, and as they're buying Bibles. And here's the basis on which people buy Bibles: color, price, and is it easily read? And I mean, they take like 2 minutes to read through a verse or two, and then that's the one I want, without giving any regard to any of the things we're talking about. Here's a third thing. On which Greek text is the translation based? And that is, there is the majority, Textus Receptus, based on the majority of the manuscripts, more about that in a moment, and the minority text based upon two of the oldest manuscripts. Let me diagram that so you can understand what we're talking about. Have you ever read from a text and somebody else is reading from another translation, and either your version or their version left half the verse out? Have you ever done that? Or they say, well, this verse is not in my text at all. That's missing the whole verse. That's because of this division right here. Now, the difference is there are over 5,000 extant manuscripts. The majority text, called the Textus Receptus, or majority text, is based on the majority of those manuscripts. The minority text, also called, and if you're reading from the New King James, you ever notice a footnote will say "in you"? And you wonder, what is that? That's Nestle's United Bible Society text. That's a minority text. It's going to give you the variant reading. Or Westcott Hort. That's based on the minority of the text, that is on two of the oldest manuscripts. And I don't have time to get into all of that, nor am I qualified. That is a whole field of scholarship wherein they disagree. But the argument is the majority have got to be the better, or the minority because they are the oldest, which means they are the best. The argument goes, on the other side, they're oldest because they were less used, because they were not the best manuscripts. That's a whole field of textual criticism. Now, there is not anything in the variation of those that is going to destroy or establish your faith. Take all the verses out that are in question, I don't think it's going to destroy your faith. There is other text that's going to establish the same thing. Like Mark 16:9 through the end of the chapter is missing. But I can establish every one of those points from other texts. So it doesn't destroy your faith, is my point. Now, the King James and the New King James is based on the majority text. Almost all others are either based or heavily influenced by the minority text. The Revised Standard, the New International, New American Standard. I put the American Standard there because it is influenced by the minority text. However, it is a revision of the King James. You say, how do you know? Philip Schaff, chairman of the committee, said so. That's how I know that to be the case. So know those three principles about translations in the background. Stick that in the back of your mind as we talk about translations. All right? Let's talk about main text versus comparative text. In the main text, this is your study text. The Bible you buy that you're going to study or live by, your preferred text. Be very careful in choosing your translation. I'm not going to get into the argument over the minority versus majority. I favor the majority text. But you may say, I am convinced the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus manuscripts are the superior, okay? Have at that. I'm not going to argue that with you. And so you're going to favor maybe the Revised Standard or something, all right? Have at that. I'm not going to argue that. But my point is, determine what translation you're going to use and stick with that. But choose it very carefully, because that's your main study text that you're going to follow. Now, comparative texts, we're merely using them for comparison to enhance our understanding. This is not something I'm putting my faith and my confidence in for my salvation on maybe a looser translation. I may use a looser, freer translation, but I want you to understand this point. They may do very well, even better on this particular phrase or this particular verse, though they may miss it in other places. Does that make sense? Sometimes the New International captures the thought, I think, better than the King James, New King James, and I'll quote from that, but that doesn't mean I have great confidence and give my endorsement to one that is heavily influenced by Calvinism. Does that make sense? I'm using it for a comparative translation. There's a difference, big, big difference. So that doesn't mean we endorse them in all respects. Now let's spend time talking about two ways. I know I'm not giving much time for class discussion. I want to get on into the text itself here in a moment. But let's talk about two ways to check translations. One of these is going to be real easy for you to do, and the other is going to be a little bit more of a challenge. One of the ways we do that is check other translations of that verse. In other words, you're reading from, let's just take, let me just give an example. We're looking at James chapter 1, verse 21, the engrafted word. So we want to know what that means. And so I may go to the American Standard, I may go to the New International, I may go to the English Standard, New American Standard, and I check other translations to see what they say, and they'll help my understanding of that. But the other way is to check how that same original word is translated in your same translation, your preferred translation. Does that make sense? Let me give you an example. Let's take this right here. Let's go to Acts chapter 11, verse 26. The text says, the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. The disciples were called Christians. Sometimes it's argued that the word called means that that was a name of derision given to them. And I beg to differ, that means God called them Christians. Now let's take that same word called, and we'll talk about how we do this in a moment, but that's the same word, she shall be called an adulteress. Who called her an adulteress? God did. Not in derision, but she's called an adulteress by God. That same word is translated divinely instructed in Acts 10, Hebrews 8, translated divinely warned in Matthew 2 and Hebrews 11. Does that make sense? See how that enhanced my understanding of the text? They were called Christians. They were divinely called Christians because that term is used in these other places, even though it may not be translated called. Divinely warned is the same word translated called. That's in my same translation. Now, that raises a question here. How do I do this? You say, I like hearing you point that out, but how do I go about doing that? That's easily done if you have a Bible app or a Bible program. Not all Bible apps will do that. Probably not on the free versions. And that's why we talked about Bible programs. And I'm not saying you have to have a Bible program, not at all. That's not my point. But if you're willing to invest in one, you'll do that easily with a Bible program. There's part of the value of that. You say, I don't want to do that. All right. If you are proficient with the computer, you might want to write these down or go copy this off of the website, these slides off of the website. 3 websites here that you want to copy down. 2 of them you already have. The first one you don't. BibleTools.org, BlueLetterBible.org, and BibleStudyTools.com. They're not all the same thing. Those are 3 different websites where you can go there for free, and you don't have to have a Bible program, but you do have to have internet access. You can do it on your phone and look at your verse, find the word, and then you can find where that word is used elsewhere. All right? Make sense? There's your tool, free tool that you can use. Another way, though not as proficient, is taking Vines, for example. You can look up this word called, and Vines may tell you, not in every case, but he'll give you places where that same word is found, translated elsewhere. Sometimes. He's not going to give you a thorough list, but it may give you a little insight to that. All right? Now, I'm not pushing Bible programs. I'm just saying that's how I do that, because that's very quick, very easy, done very quickly in a matter of seconds versus taking a long time as we used to do. All right. All right, that's 2 ways of doing that. Now let's spend some time talking about examples of how translations enhance our understanding. Let's talk about other translations. Now we're going to take a text and we're going to look at other translations, how they enhance. Let's go to this passage, Romans 6:17. And I've tried to highlight the phrase we want to enhance our understanding of. And I start with the King James here. God be thanked that you were the servants of sin, but you obeyed from the heart the form of doctrine which was delivered you. You don't have to raise your hand, but just for kicks, show of hand. How many of you heard this presented and have thought, and I'll be one to raise my hand because I've preached it that way in my early years, that the text is saying, as per the King James, that you obeyed the gospel that was delivered unto you. The gospel was preached to you, and you obeyed that gospel that was preached to you. Is that what it's saying? You've heard it preached that way? I've preached it that way. Anybody have another translation that you're reading from that reads different than that?
Standard of teaching
to which you were committed. Here's the New King James. The doctrine to which you were delivered. That's going in the opposite direction. The American Standard, the form of teaching whereunto you were delivered. It's in the context of servitude. Master slaves. When a slave would be sold, he would be delivered to the new master. That fits the context. Most other translations will talk about to which you were delivered. That enhanced my understanding of that. So you see, I'm not studying so much the text tonight, we're doing the mechanics. Teaching you how to fish, not giving you a fish. Make sense? See how the translation helped my understanding? And now that fits the context. All right, let's try that again. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians 5:22. Abstain from all appearance of evil. Again, just in interest, a show of hands, how many of you heard it preached that we ought to abstain from something that looks bad because we are to abstain from the appearance of evil? And so that's why you ought not be doing this or that. Even though it's not wrong, it looks like you're doing wrong because we're to abstain from the appearance of evil. I've heard that. I heard it from my own mouth. That's not what the text is saying. Anybody got another translation that'll help you? All right. New American Standard 95, every form of evil. The New King James, English Standard, abstain from every form of evil, every kind of evil, the NIV. Now, I don't give my endorsement to the NIV. I've written on that translation very, very heavily on that one. But I like that. I think they did better right here. The New Living Translation, stay away from every kind of evil. What it's saying, so is the word appearance a bad word? No. What it's saying is stay away from evil in any form in which it appears. Every appearance of evil. If it appears in the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, stay away from it. If it's in family life, stay away from it. If it's in business life, whatever. Stay away from every kind of evil. That's the point of the text. Now, Did that help you see that, whether you already knew that or not? The translations kind of helped my understanding of that. All right, let's go again. Let's try another passage. Zephaniah 1:12. Zephaniah 1:12. It shall come to pass in that time that I will search out Jerusalem with the lamps and punish men who are settled in complacency. Anybody got a translation reads different than that? I hope you do. Who are complacent? Stagnant in spirit. Anybody got another one? Well, here's several. And by the way, here's where I learned something. If you have, and that's one reason I encourage you to buy a Bible that has center reference columns. Center reference versus other types of notes are better because they're usually more, starts with a T, thorough. Thorough, yeah. They're usually more thorough. There's more notes in the center reference than usually the bottom of the page notes. All right? But New King James is full of that. And a footnote says, literally on their leaves like dregs of wine. Now that may not help my understanding, but when I look at what lees means and dregs of wine, I'm beginning to get a concept of what's going on. Make sense? Maybe my footnote is more difficult to understand than the rendering of the text, but it may enhance my understanding when I research that, when I understand what lees is. It has to do with the settlement at the bottom of the fermented wine. That's what it's talking about. The things which settle at the bottom. And not the liquor on the top, but the settlement at the bottom. All right? I'm not going to read every one of these. Men who are complacent. Footnote says Hebrew are thickening on their dregs. The thickening, something that thickens and settles at the bottom. Settled on their lees, stagnant in spirit, whose senses are dulled, entrenched in their sins, thickening on their lees. All I'm trying to get you to see is these various translations are not confusing, but they're enhancing. Does that make sense? Somebody said, I hear people say all the time, all these different translations are confusing. No. They're helpful to me. Quite often when somebody's reading from the New King James, reading from, say, the New American Standard, I'm reading from the New King James with them, and it reads differently. That doesn't confuse me. It enhances my understanding. I can see what mine's saying. I'm hearing another one. Maybe I'm the only one that can think in two directions, but if you can, that helps. It really does help. Make sense? All right, here's what I want you to see. The translations can help me to come to an understanding of what settled in complacency means. It is referring to just as something settles down in the wine and hasn't been separated, hasn't been stirred. Here are people who settle down in their ease and they've not been stirred. So there's more meaning to the phrase. All right, let's go again. Let's go to Romans 14:1. Go to Romans 14:1. We're all familiar with Romans 14. It basically is a passage that says we can agree to disagree, but the question is, what kind of things are going on? We've talked about that even recently, but let's just assume we don't know. And we're trying to figure this out. We're trying to figure out what this text is talking about. So it says, receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to dispute over doubtful things. Anybody have a translation that's going to help us? Say again and tell me what translation it is. English Standard, over opinions. Anybody got another one?
Without quarreling over disputable matters.
Over
NIV.
NIV. All right. Yeah, the American Standard said over scruples, over opinions. New American Standard, what did you have back there? That was English Standard on opinions. And what was this one again? Disputable matters, NIV. Do you see how, while I'm driving at, how looking at another translation may help me to understand that? That doubtful things has to do with opinions or scruples. Now when I go through the context, let's see if that fits. So we do some pretending in this class. Let's pretend we've had time to read through that, and we just saw there was a dispute over eating of meats. Doesn't matter one way or the other whether you eat meats. But some think you can't and some think you can. So those are matters of opinion. That fits. That helped me to understand. We're talking about opinions or scruples. Now I understand better the text. talking about Christian liberties. Make sense? We're not giving you fish, we're teaching you how to fish. That's what we're talking about. All right, let's go again. Let's go to Acts 12 and verse 1, or verse 11, excuse me. But Peter, when he came to himself, this is when Peter, being released from prison, now I know for certain the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the Jewish people. I don't know about you, but I don't normally talk that way. And people who talk to me don't normally say, I have been delivered from the expectation of the Jews. What on earth is he talking about? Anybody got a translation that may help us? By the way, that's New King James, so I need something different. From all the Jewish people expected. What is that? Christian Standard. All right? I got another one.
The NIV, the Jewish people were hoping with that.
Say again.
The Jewish people were hoping would happen.
What the Jewish people were hoping would happen. Yes. What was that? The NIV? NIV. So here's the New Century from all the things people thought would happen. The New Living Translation and the Jewish people had planned to do to me. In other words, I was delivered from what the Jewish people were hoping they would do to me. That makes sense to me. I talk that way rather than talking about the expectation of the Jewish people. Now I understand that. At least I may have understood it before, but now I'm more equipped. Finish my sentence. Say again? To explain it to somebody else. And that translation helps me to justify my commentary that I'm going to give. Somebody said, what do you think this means? I think it's probably talking about what the Jewish leaders planned to do. Like the NLT, like the NCV, like the NIV said. So I have a little justification. Doesn't mean those translations are always right, but that gives me a little justification for my interpretation. Make sense? Yes, sir.
I know Brother Carlin, when I was studying, and I hadn't studied a whole lot before, I said, what kind of book do you study besides the Bible? And I said, I didn't get a Bible, something. He said, you know what, you get you an English dictionary and see what that word they're trying to say is first, and understand that word before you look at different translations.
Right.
To get a good comparison.
That's a good point. Like I might want to look up, if I didn't understand the word expectation, I might want to see what that means and see if I can make sense of that before I look. But maybe sometimes that may mislead me if I'm missing what the original text had to say. We'll get into that when we look at Greek and Hebrew words. All right, let's go again. Let's go to 2 Timothy 1:6. Therefore, I remind you to stir up the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. Well, we don't have time to look at the whole context of that as to what the gift may be, but I'm interested more here in the stirring up of the gift. So whether this had reference to an appointment to a task or it had reference to the impartation of spiritual gifts is beside the point as far as I'm concerned tonight. Now, if we were studying 2 Timothy 1, we'd go through that and try to decide. I'm not interested in that right now, but I'm interested now in whatever gift this is. Paul tells Timothy to stir it up. Anybody got a translation that may help us here? Fan into flame. That's ESV. Does that help?
Kindle the embers up. Keep burning.
Amplified. So read that again. Give that again.
Rekindle the embers and keep burning.
All right. Rekindle the embers and keep burning. Do you have one, John? All right. Rekindle the gift. Yeah, ESV. Fan into flame the gift. In New American Standard, kindle afresh the gift of God. Do those translations help? See, that helps me to understand what it means to stir up the gift. I think I know, but now that's helping me to understand. Just like a fire, you fan the flame and you stir it up. That here is the gift I have. If I'm going to make application to me, here is some responsibility, some ability I have. I may need to fan the flame and get it to go into be a bigger fire. Does that make sense? Now I got the picture. The translations help me with that. All right, let's go again. Let's go to Hosea 6 and verse 6. Just trying to give us sampling how this all works. Let's go to Hosea 6 and verse 6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Now let's just focus on that phrase, mercy, not sacrifice. If someone were to ask you, I've been reading my Bible and God said I desire mercy and not sacrifice, but I thought he did desire sacrifice. Can you explain that to me? How would you explain it? One of the first things I would do, check translations and see if I can find another phrase from another translation that may enhance my understanding. Here's one, the New Century Version. I want faithful love more than I want animal sacrifices. Now, is that kind of a free translation? I don't mean free in the price, but it's a little freer and it's not wooden. Yeah, it is. So I'm probably not going to use the New Century Version for my preferred translation, but you hear me quote from it a lot because I like the way they word things. I quote from it very frequently. If you haven't caught that, you'll catch it from now on. I think New Century, you'll hear a lot. But I think it gets the idea. I want faithful love more than I want animal sacrifice. Now I understand that. That makes sense to me. All right, here's another New American Standard 95. For a delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, rather than mere sacrifices. God doesn't want just mere sacrifice. What he wants is loyalty. Any application we can make of that today? Does God want us to sacrifice?
Sacrifice our time and our money to work at the church. He wants us to give.
All right, let's just take money. You mentioned money. What if I give money and I give a lot of money and that is a sacrifice? Is God pleased with that? Not necessarily. Why do you say not necessarily?
Because it has to be something that's coming from your heart, not just for show or just.
Bingo. I want loyalty rather than sacrifice. Does God want me to give? Sure. But he wants more than just giving. He wants my loyalty. That's what it means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I delight in faithfulness, not simply in sacrifice, NET. That's a little more wooden than some of the other translations, by the way. I like checking the NET. Let's go to Acts 17, verse 11. Do you remember the Bereans were more noble than those in Thessalonica? In interest of time, let me share with you these translations. What does it mean they were more noble? If somebody asks you, I've read this verse, what does it mean they were more noble? Well, I think I know what noble means, but these translations are going to help me a lot. Like they're more fair-minded, more noble character, more willing to listen, more receptive, the New Revised Standard Version, more open-minded. Now I got an idea of what it means. They were more noble. They were open-minded. They were receptive. They had a noble character. That's what the nobleness was about, was their open-mindedness. Make sense? All right, let's keep going. Let's shift gears now. Remember we talked about that we might want to look for how a word is translated in my same preferred text. So that's where, again, a Bible program or some of the online things will be helpful to you, where you can go and you say, but I want to know how that's translated in the ESV. I don't want to know about the King James and New King James. You can set your Bible program or you can set your online program to tell you how that word is used in this translation. Make sense? It's helpful. All right, let's get some examples of that. Let's take this word right here. I exhort you, warn those who are unruly, comfort the faint-hearted, uphold the weak, be patient with all. I do not have time to develop this thought fully, but you may go in your Bible translation, for example, and it says this word is just used one time. And you say, well, that's not found anywhere else. That form of the word may only be found. Does that make sense? It's like the word friend and the word friendly and the word friends. That same word might be used over here, but it's a different form of that word. That makes sense? And yet when I look up the word, I'm using English words, but I'm thinking of Greek or Hebrew word. I may be looking for this word friendly, and it's only used one time. Yeah, but the word friend may be used 100 times. Make sense? So be careful about drawing conclusions real quickly. All right, where can I find this? Well, I'm going to do my research, and I'm going to find that same word is translated disorderly, or the same root word is translated disorderly. Does that help me now understand? So there's a difference in being unruly and being faint-hearted and being weak. Not everybody who's weak is disorderly. Do you see some conclusions I'm drawing? Somebody said, well, brother so-and-so is kind of weak. We need to withdraw from him. We're to withdraw from the disorderly. We're to warn the disorderly, but they're different from the weak. That's not the same person. That's not the same class of person. Does that make sense? So that helped me understand who the unruly. It also helps me to understand who the disorderly are, because I'm looking and I found that same word used in another place. Make sense? All right, that one's pretty clear. Let's look at this one. This is a word we use a lot, and that's the word fellowship. Koinonia. You would know that if I just said, what is the word koinonia? You've heard that mentioned a number of times. That means fellowship. 1 John 1 and verse 7. If you have a Bible program, you might click on your word and see if you don't see the word koinonia. Do a Bible word study or do an inline search for that Greek word. And what you're going to find is it's translated in the New King James. That's what I'm using. Your translation may be different. It's translated contribution. Talking about the contribution to the collection for the saints. The word fellowship described that. When you put into this collection, we're having fellowship. That's fellowship we're having. When we take money out of that and support brother so-and-so, we're having fellowship. That's what it was called. Make sense? All right? It's used with reference to the communion, the Lord's Supper, where we commune with the Lord. That's the word koinonia. Same word is translated sharing with reference to giving to needy saints. Now that's interesting to me. A contribution, the giving to the needy saints, and the Lord's Supper, all is the same word, koinonia, for fellowship. Make sense? Does that help our understanding? So fellowship has to do with sharing. It has to do with communion. It has to do with contributing. Does that make sense? That enhanced my understanding. Now I'm seeing how that same word is translated in my preferred text. All right, let's go again. 1 Timothy 2 and verse 9. Let's take the word modest. We need to know what the word modest means. To dress in modest apparel. So we look up, as Tim just mentioned a moment ago, we get our English dictionary out and it'll say, has a sense of reservation. Okay, that's good. I like that. And reserved spirit, character. All right, I like that. But that same word is translated world. Does that help me at all? God loves the world that God created. Cosmos is the same word translated modest. What's going on in the world? Is it chaos? No, I'm not talking about the people. I'm talking about the creation. There's order. There's order. So the dress is to be orderly. There's a common connection. Makes sense? Same word is translated of good behavior. Revelation 21, as a bride is adorned for her husband. She's dressed appropriately for her husband. Now I'm understanding a little more about this word modest. Let's go again, and I want to do this one quickly because I want to move, and we're running out of time. I wanted to get to our assignment. But the word forgive is translated leave, send away, have omitted, and let go. That gives me a better understanding of what forgiveness. Forgiveness is the idea of releasing. When I forgive someone of the wrong they have done, I'm releasing that, letting it go. That's how it's translated. Let go, having omitted, send away and leave. You say, I'll forgive you, but I'll never forget. You're saying, I'm not letting go. You're not forgiving. The word forgive is same word. In that same translation is saying let go and release and turn loose. I don't know about you, but that helps me to understand what I'm to do in forgetting. Does that make sense? All right. Let's, any questions or comments on the use of translations? Well, let's go to our question or assignment for tonight. Now, just what I'm not expecting you to do, we've talked about staying at a basic level and maybe dipping down a little deeper, looking for that, how that word is used, that same Greek word or Hebrew word is used throughout, maybe going below the surface. But if you're still in the boat up here on the surface, you could still see us. We didn't go very far. We didn't get very deep. We're going to get a little deeper than that. But we're going to keep that basic level going throughout. Now let's talk about our assigned text. For last week we didn't get to, and we probably won't get to Deuteronomy tonight. So we're just going to keep pushing off 1 week. 1 Peter 3:19, what is meant by preaching to the spirits in prison? Were they in prison at the time the message was preached to them? Some have the idea that the gospel was preached to those that were in prison, whatever that is. And they were in prison at the time they were preached to, so one who has died and has gone to the Hadean realm, the gospel could be preached and they could still be salvaged. Maybe. Maybe that's what it's saying. What say ye?
If you're in sin, you're in prison. You're in prison of sin.
All right? That's true. The question is that what this text is saying? We always start after we're going to read and read and read, aren't we? And so in reading, we're looking for starts with a C, it's on the screen, context. All right, context. So the context is dealing with holiness and duties of holiness. And so let's pretend we've had time to develop that, and we're noticing that verse 19 is setting right where Christ is an example of suffering. So let's expand on that. Let's read that section. We read it and we read it, and we see he was innocent, he was patient in suffering. That's the point being made, and he was victorious. Something about Christ's suffering and being patient where this preaching to the spirits in prison comes about. Let's go a little further. I want to know what prison has reference to. What's going to give me a clue? It most likely refers to death, because he talks about the spirits in prison. That's comparable to and harmonizes with Jude 6, 2 Peter 2, and 4. We don't have time to go there. You can trace that.
All right, Don, can I ask a question?
Sure.
1 John 4, when it talks about testing the spirits, they're false prophets.
Yeah.
That was the first one I thought of when he talked about it, because it seems like spirits is that's the word that's kind of jamming us up in that verse. And if we go to 1 John 4, we'll think, okay, what spirit is he talking about over here in 1 John 4? He's calling them testing spirits.
Which context deals with false teachers. And spirit is used in two different senses in Romans 8. Sometimes the Holy Spirit, sometimes man's human spirit. So I can find 5 or 6 different ways maybe the term spirit is used. I have to think about whether I'm accurate on the number. But a human spirit, the Holy Spirit, false teachers, spirits that are departed. That's at least 4. I think I could think of a 5th one in a moment. So the finding the term spirit is not going to help me within itself. But I notice he mentions spirits in prison, and I know there's the realm of the departed spirits, but he gives an example. This is where context helps me. What is the thing that he says next? Something is in the past. Notice by whom he went and preached to the spirits in prison. Who is the who? The spirits that are described as being in prison. Who formerly were disobedient when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. This is an example of the patience of Christ. He preached to the spirits in prison. When did he do that? In the days of Noah. Who formerly were disobedient when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared when few 8 souls were saved by water. So I know now, because it's spirits that are in prison, and I know spirits are in the Paedean realm, but the example he gives is in the days of Noah. Christ preached through Noah. Can the preaching of Noah be contributed to Christ? And the answer is yes, because the preaching of Paul was attributed to Christ. How could that be? Because Christ would be, in either case, the source of the message preached. Make sense? All right? It is not said that the spirits were in prison at the time of preaching. Now this is where translation will help. Anybody got the NASB 95? NASB 95. Anybody got that? Say it. Read it. Verse 19.
In which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison.
Now in prison. Now, whether justified or not, we'll look at the Greek text. But my point is, their translation thought, that helps me a little bit. Here was some translators who thought that he's talking about the spirits that are now in prison, not that they were in prison at the time they were preached to. Now that harmonizes. I know that fits. How do I know it fits? Because the example he gave are the people in the days of Noah. At the time Peter is writing, where are those people? They're not alive. They're departed spirits now. They're in the Hadean realm. They're now in prison. And you say, why do they call it prison? That was the language that was used, not the word prison, but they were held in chains. Jude 6, 2 Peter 2, 4. Does that make sense? So what is the text saying? So what I'm trying to demonstrate to you, more than explain the text, is I'm looking at context. I'm looking at a word. I'm looking at the concept of prison and the concept of chains, connecting those. I'm also looking more at the context of the example that was given, and I'm looking at a translation to help me out. Does that make sense? That process is called, when you take a text, you look at the context, you define words, you look at translations, we refer to that as hermeneutics. Does that make sense? Questions, comments? Time is gone. Guess what? We didn't get to Deuteronomy 24. So next week we're going to deal with Deuteronomy 24, hopefully. We're one off. But that's not bad for us. That's not bad.